Yes, Mr. Booker.
Sir, we are turning today to Scottish Government decision-making, focusing on the period from the 1970s to about the early 1990s. I'm going to start with a handful of introductory points, most of which will be familiar to those who have followed previous inquiry presentations. This oral presentation accompanies a written note, which has now been disclosed on the inquiry website. The written note, as will be obvious to those who've seen it, is lengthy. It covers a large number of documents which are available on Relativity. I certainly won't be covering every document or issue that are contained in the written note today. I should also say, as I've said before in presentations, that while the written note is lengthy, it doesn't purport to address every relevant document. No doubt there will be further documents and points brought to your attention by core participants and legal representatives in due course. The inquiry team also intends to disclose a much shorter addendum note on a particular issue that I'll touch on later today. It relates to the hepatitis waiver, or the waiver that applied in Scotland in the context of the HIV haemophilia litigation, and in particular, whether that waiver covered only only HIV, or both HIV and hepatitis. I'll come back to that later on today, sir, but we also intend to disclose a short addendum note addressing it. Now, in terms of witness evidence on Scottish Government decision-making, the inquiry's already heard from Duncan McNiven and Lord Forsyth. The inquiry is also obtaining a further witness statement from a Scottish Government official. That's Mr. John Davis, who was a senior official in the Scottish Home and Health Department between 1983 and 1985. We will see his name appear on a number of documents relating to AIDS in particular during the course of today. The inquiry is in the process of obtaining that statement, and it should be available shortly. Both the written note and what I say orally will fall to be considered alongside that statement and Mr. Davis's evidence. Now, the structure of the rest of today will broadly follow the structure of the written note for those who are following it. I should flag that one topic I intend to miss out more or less completely today is self-sufficiency and the supply of blood products. Now, that topic was, of course, considered in some detail in the March hearings. The written note adds some further detail on the involvement of Scottish Government decision-makers, but it looks at very similar issues and a similar chronology to the material considered in March. The evidence that's available is in the written note, but I'll be focusing on other topics today. Finally, on terminology, much of the material that we're going to be looking at today concerns the Scottish Home and Health Department, the SHHD, which is a bit of a mouthful sometimes. I'll occasionally refer to it as the HHD, occasionally as the department. I will try to make clear when I'm contrasting it with the equivalent department in England and Wales, the DHSS, or the Department of Health. So I'm going to move now, sir, to the structure and organisation of the HHD and the Scottish Office, relatively briefly, and its relationship with other bodies. Now, it will be apparent from the written note that the sources we rely on to outline the structure and organisation of the HHD and its position within the Scottish Office mainly involve witness evidence. That includes witnesses who gave evidence to the Penrose inquiry and witnesses to this inquiry, such as Duncan McNiven. The note also makes reference to a document created during the course of the Penrose inquiry, which summarises the structure of the HHD in the 1980s, lists the names and titles of a number of officials and ministers, and that's a document which is set out in the written note. Now, that and a significant part of the available witness evidence focuses on the 1980s, but many of the key features of the way in which the department was structured also apply to the 1970s. Now, as the witnesses we have heard from in this inquiry have noted, during the 1970s and 1980s, the Scottish Office was, of course, part of the wider UK government. It was headed by a Secretary of State for Scotland, beneath whom were a number of more junior ministers. Now, that Secretary of State for Scotland was a member of Cabinet, but there were a number of areas in which decision-making, policy and decision-making, was devolved and fell to Scottish Office ministers and officials. health, including blood services, was one of them. One of the issues we'll look at further during the course of today is a relationship between those decisions taken in Scotland and the wider UK government. Now, the Scottish Office itself was divided into a number of departments, one of which was the HHD. Each department reported to one or more junior ministers, and through the junior minister to the Secretary of State. The junior minister with responsibility for health could be a parliamentary Under-Secretary of State or a Minister of State. Ministerial responsibilities were allocated by the Secretary of State for Scotland. As with the DHSS, the HHD had a dual hierarchy of officials. On one side were administrative officials, on the other were medical officials. Both contributed to advice to ministers. A very brief summary of the administrative structure. The hierarchy of administrative officials in the HHD was headed by the HHD Secretary, who reported to the Scottish Office Permanent Secretary. Beneath the HHD Secretary were Under-Secretaries, then an Assistant Secretary, occasionally called a Senior Principal. Underneath the Assistant Secretary, Senior Executive Officers, sometimes referred to as Principals. Departments in the Scottish Office were divided into groups. Each one was headed by an Under-Secretary. Each group was divided into several divisions. At the head of a division was an Assistant Secretary. Generally speaking, groups were referred to by a Roman numeral, followed by a letter. Sometimes the particular Roman numeral and particular letter changed over the course of the years. Divisions were then generally divided into branches, and at the head of a branch was a senior executive officer. On the medical side, the hierarchy of medical officials was headed by the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, the CMO, beneath whom were Deputy Chief Medical Officers, DCMOs, Principal Medical Officers, Senior Medical Officers, and Medical Officers. Until 1974, the HHD had one DCMO to whom Principal Medical Officers reported. In 1974, a second DCMO post was created, and the two individuals who were in post from the mid-1970s in that period were Dr. Ian MacDonald, Dr. Graham Scott. We'll see their names appear on a number of documents we look at today. In 1985, Dr. MacDonald was appointed CMO, and the hierarchy beneath him reverted to just one DCMO. Now, the Principal Medical Officer from 1977 to the early 1990s was Dr. Archibald McIntyre. That's a name that will appear a number of times today. The Senior Medical Officer with responsibility for blood services from around 1973 to 1985 was Dr. Albert Bell. We'll see him appear a number of times today, as we will with Dr. John Forrester, who replaced Dr. Bell in 1985 until 1988. Now, the CMO in Scotland and DCMOs had a wide range of responsibilities. Dr. MacDonald, when giving evidence to the Penrose inquiry, described two practices which he said were intended to keep the CMO and the DCMO aware of the work of the medical staff beneath them. The first one was a meeting every Monday morning, which was chaired by the CMO or a DCMO, attended by PMOs heading each of the group's principal medical officers. He said these were quite formal meetings, no notes were taken. The second mechanism was a monthly report written by senior medical officers and medical officers, which were generally known, I think, as PMO reports, Principal Medical Officer reports, which set out the issues and the activities medical officials had been involved in during that month. Dr. MacDonald's evidence by the time of the Penrose inquiry is, unfortunately, those reports were no longer available. That remains the case today, although we will occasionally see documents which seem to have been intended to contribute to PMO reports. One of the issues that was explored in witness evidence we've heard previously in this inquiry with Mr. McNiven and Lord Forsyth was the relationship between ministers and officials in the HHD and the wider Scottish Office. In particular, how it was decided whether or not an issue should be put to a minister for a decision or to inform them about an issue. I'm not going to repeat that evidence that's already been given. The thrust of it was that there were no set criteria, and it was a matter of judgment for the officials to decide when to put an issue to ministers. I am going to highlight a paragraph in written evidence to the Penrose inquiry which casts some further light on this issue. It comes from the statement of Alexander Murray. Lawrence, if we could please have PRSE 302440. So this is the statement of Alexander Murray for the Penrose inquiry. It was on the topic of HIV testing. Mr. Murray was a senior executive officer in the HHD between 1983 and 1987. This statement was considering in particular the introduction of HIV testing, but there's a section that's of more general relevance for our purposes. So if we could go to page 4, please. And then the third paragraph, if we could, that's great, thank you. So the first sentence refers to the evaluation programme relating to the introduction of HIV testing, but Mr. Murray goes on to describe...
Well, can you help with that? Because much depends on timing in respect of this. What is meant by at this stage? Can you link that back for us, please, to what he says earlier?
I believe he's referring to the timing of the decision to put this issue to Scottish Office ministers in the first few months of 1985 and how officials went about deciding.
Well, can you be any more precise about that?
So I will, if I may, I might come back to being a bit more precise about that.
The reason for my asking is this, that the idea of evaluating appears to have arisen initially in January 1985, the DHSS. It's not entirely clear when it was taken forward, but it would have been sometime between mid-January and early February in the DHSS. It would appear from what is said in this statement that the Scottish ministers were not notified in advance that there would be an evaluation programme and therefore weren't in a position, if they had wished to do so, to challenge it and say, well, why are we evaluating, why don't we get on with it, or whatever might have crossed their minds. And that's why I'm so interested in the precise date.
So I can quite see why you're interested in the precise date. I'm going to come back to the introduction of HIV screening.
It's not, if you can't answer it off the top, then better a considered answer in due course.
Thank you, sir. I could try to give you an answer off the top, but it would be a bit too rough and ready, and I'll make sure that I have a more precise date to give you linking to this paragraph when we get to the introduction of HIV screening later on today. Thank you. So we can see in this paragraph that's highlighted here, Mr. Murray describing the sorts of factors which might lead to a minister being involved directly in an issue. And he says, an issue like this would normally be brought to ministers' attention in the following circumstances: to keep ministers aware of important current developments, if something was going to appear in the media, if a decision had to be made which officials considered only ministers can make, if an interdepartmental dispute needed to be resolved, to bring together in an overview submission a number of issues affecting multiple divisions within a department or multiple departments, or where developments in Scotland affected UK departments and vice versa. When a department considered an issue was of such importance that the final decision required to be made by the Secretary of State, the submission would be in the form of going first to the junior minister concerned and then to the Secretary of State. As we go during the course of today to submissions which were put to ministers in the HHD, we will come across some of those circumstances.
There's an element of circularity, is there, about those reasons. As you say, it's a matter of judgment, but keeping ministers aware of important current developments demands someone considering that there is, first of all, a development. Secondly, it's a current development. But thirdly, it's important. Those are all matters which, in each of them, in turn, to a greater or lesser extent, involve a judgment. And then if something's going to appear in the media, well, that speaks for itself. But a decision had to, the next one, if a decision had to be made which officials considered only ministers could make. Again, it's exactly the same, isn't it? It's you're sending something to a minister which a minister should decide. Well, that's a question of judgment again, isn't it?
That's exactly right, sir, yes. Yes, a number of these factors come back, as you just said, to a question of judgment. They're consistent with what, for example, Mr. McNiven said. They don't give us a precise answer. They don't give us a set of criteria by which that judgment was evaluated. Some of them are perhaps a bit more hard-edged, like something appearing in the media, but you're absolutely right, sir, that many of them come back to the question of the official's judgment.
I mean, I suspect that, as with most matters of judgment, generally most people would agree, but it doesn't answer the point, really. It doesn't provide a specific objective criterion beyond what is set out.
That's absolutely right, sir, yes.
Thank you.
We can take that down now. Thanks, Lawrence. Now, the nature of the relationship between the Scottish Office and the wider UK government, more particularly between the HHD and the DHSS, or later the Department of Health, is an important aspect of our understanding of HHD decision-making in this period. The written note records, at a more general level, some of the different ways in which that relationship has been described by witnesses both to this inquiry and to the Penrose inquiry. There might be said to be contrasts that can be drawn between those descriptions, or at least differences in emphasis between them. For example, the note records Dr. MacDonald's evidence at the Penrose inquiry, when Dr. MacDonald said that on major policy matters, the DHSS would have been expected to take the lead, and other departments, such as the HHD, would have been expected to fit their policy around the lead of the DHSS. He put it another way when he said that the DHSS would be expected to take the lead, and then other departments would implement a common policy subject to a modest degree of adaptation informed by local circumstances. Now, those comments should be considered alongside other evidence, such as that of Mr. McNiven. Mr. McNiven commented that as a matter of good administration, the HHD and the DHSS will have kept each other in touch with developments in one country that might affect the other, but he described the health service in Scotland as being entirely devolved to the Secretary of State for Scotland, and through him to the HHD, emphasised that the DHSS had no oversight role. Similarly, Lord Forsyth, while stating that there were occasions on which he felt that the DHSS or the wider UK government hadn't consulted sufficiently with the Scottish Office, said that broadly speaking, every Secretary of State for Scotland used to say that they were Scotland's person in the Cabinet, not the Cabinet's person in Scotland. Now, that's really just a broad brush overview picture of this issue, so you may wish to consider it and may well hear submissions on how that relationship operated in the context of particular issues, for example, the introduction of hepatitis C screening. Now, the written note also seeks to summarise evidence relating to the HHD's relationships with other bodies such as the Common Services Agency and the SMBTS. I'm not going to go very much further into that now. One of the issues that arises in that context is the extent to which there were difficulties or tension in the relationship between the HHD and the SMBTS, particularly Professor Cash, the extent to which such difficulties may have affected decision-making. It was explored in witness evidence to some extent, for example, with Mr. McNiven. The written note contains some documents, some of which suggest strains in the relationship at points, but there is more detail, as I say, in the written note. I'm going to turn now, sir, to a different topic, which is Home and Health Department knowledge and decision-making in relation to hepatitis B, and in particular issues relating to the screening of blood donations for the virus. Now, most of the available documents on this issue relate to the position in the 1970s. There is some evidence available of the HHD's understanding of hepatitis B in the 1960s. I'm going to highlight one of those documents now. Lawrence, could we please have SCGV 40-279_165. Now, this is a letter that we can see from the date in the top right-hand corner that was sent on the 27th of September 1968. The letter heading at the top is the Scottish Home and Health Department. If we could go through, please, Lawrence, just to the second page for a moment. And we can see the signature at the bottom of the page. It comes from the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland at that time, Dr. Brotherton. If we go back, please, to the top of the letter, it's addressed to Dear Doctor. If we go, please, Lawrence, to the bottom of this page, we can see who Dr. Brotherton meant: medical officers of health, general medical practitioners. And back up, please, again to the first paragraph. We can see the reason why this letter was being sent. Dr. Brotherton says that from 1st of October 1968, infective jaundice and measles will be generally notifiable under the Public Health Infectious Diseases Scotland Amendment Regulations 1968. The third paragraph makes it a little bit clearer why this letter is being sent. The principal object of making all forms of infective jaundice generally notifiable is to enable medical officers of health to inquire into the epidemiological background.
Now, infective jaundice was not necessarily serum hepatitis.
Well, what we see in the next two paragraphs I'm going to take you to, sir, is Dr. Brotherton seems to use the term infective jaundice to cover both what we understand becomes hepatitis A and also serum hepatitis B. So in the fourth paragraph that begins, the majority, says the majority of cases of infective jaundice notified under the new regulations are likely to be due to infective hepatitis, which is a common condition believed to be of increasing.
Well, that's what he deals with above. That's not serum hepatitis.
It's not, sir. No,
So,
and then
we go to what is of interest to us is the last paragraph, is it?
It's the next paragraph. It's not quite the last one because there are more below that. So he starts with what becomes hepatitis A. He then moves to serum hepatitis, which is what's of interest to us. And he says this. I wanted to just highlight the first few sentences in this paragraph. Serum hepatitis occurs less frequently than infective hepatitis. It's potentially a more serious condition with a longer incubation period of usually 60 to 160 days. Transmission is almost invariably by a parenteral route, and a history of blood transfusion or of an injection by any parenteral route within the incubation period may suggest this disease. And then in the last sentence of this paragraph, he refers to outbreaks both of infective hepatitis and serum hepatitis having been reported in a number of units undertaken intermittent hemodialysis for the treatment of chronic renal failure. We'll come back to points at which that sort of issue comes up in the early 1970s. So that's a document which, relatively brief, but at least makes some reference to the HHD's understanding of serum hepatitis in the late 1960s. We move forwards to the early 1970s, and what we see in the available documents is the HHD becoming involved in debates amongst regional transfusion directors in Scotland over the introduction of screening of blood donations for Australia Antigen for serum hepatitis, what becomes known as hepatitis B screening. We can see evidence of the debate that takes place around this time. In June 1970, a meeting takes place on that date to discuss a policy which might be recommended on the use of Australia Antigen screening of blood donations, the details in the written note. That meeting took place at around the same time as an outbreak of hepatitis in Edinburgh, which was in a renal unit, a hemodialysis unit. That meeting at which this issue was discussed was attended by transfusion directors and the HHD, including Dr. MacDonald. The note of the meeting, which we have, records that prior to the Edinburgh outbreak, Scottish transfusion directors had felt that the time was not yet ripe for the screening of blood. Their position begins to change around this time, and there seems to be a view that screening should be introduced at least for high-risk patients, such as those undergoing dialysis, but they say it wouldn't yet be feasible to screen larger quantities of blood for other emergency use. We do see in the documents around this time, mid-1970, certain regional transfusion directors in Scotland emphasising the risk posed by serum hepatitis and pressing the HHD to support a more general introduction of screening at an earlier date. We see that in particular in correspondence from the director of the Glasgow and West of Scotland, RTC, Dr. Wallace, and we're going to come back at various points to correspondence involving Dr. Wallace. One of those, which is just summarised in the written note now, which I won't go to now, but is of interest, is a 16th of July 1970 letter written by Dr. Wallace to Dr. MacDonald at the HHD, which attached a paper on serum hepatitis and the blood transfusion service. Now, it was directed in particular at issues relating to renal dialysis, but it contains some material that's of wider relevance for our purposes. A couple of points to highlight in particular from that document, and we can take that down now, please, Lawrence. That paper provided by Dr. Wallace said that for the past 30 years, so this is 1970, for the past 30 years, homologous serum jaundice, serum hepatitis, has been recognised as a delayed complication of the transfusion of blood and blood products. Dr. Wallace also recorded that the highest incidence of serum hepatitis had been observed in recipients of plasma prepared during World War II. He said that was not surprising because it was not uncommon to prepare a plasma pool from 500 donations of blood. So we see there Dr. Wallace making a link between hepatitis risks and pool sizes and providing that information to the HHD. There was a further letter from Dr. Wallace to the HHD in August of 1970 in which he begins to press more strongly for the screening of all donations for Australia Antigen. One of the comments he makes is that even if this mass screening only reduces the incidence of serum hepatitis by 25%, it would still be a significant reduction in the incidence of what can be a serious illness. In the present climate, I think the SNBTA must be seen to be doing everything possible to reduce this serious transfusion risk. Now, by this time, which is around mid-1970, the introduction of screening for Australia Antigen was also being considered by the DHSS. In September 1970, a new group was set up, the Advisory Group on Testing for the Presence of Australia Hepatitis-Associated Antigen and its antibody, chaired by Dr. Maycock, becomes known as the Maycock advisory group. It was appointed jointly by the DHSS, the HHD and the Welsh Office. Dr. Wallace was one of its members. Now, the work of that group has been considered by the inquiry on previous occasions. I'm not going to go in detail into its development and what it found, but its work relates to the HHD's understanding and response to hepatitis risks during this period. It seems that the HHD was aware in the early 1970s, so around 1970, 1971, that Scottish RTCs, regional transfusion centres, were taking different approaches to screening, both in the extent of screening they were undertaking and in the technique they were using for screening. We move forward to May 1972. The Maycock group issues a report which recommends the introduction of routine testing of all blood donations for Australia, Antigen. And its antibody recommends a number of different testing methods. I'm going to keep moving forward to 1973, when the HHD becomes more closely involved in discussions about the appropriateness of different screening techniques for serum hepatitis. So rather than the principle of whether or not to screen or have mass screening, the appropriateness of different techniques. Now, this was an issue being considered by the Maycock group.
Well, by now, by 1973, there was general screening.
Yes.
So the question then is, what form of screening are you having?
Exactly, sir. Yes, yes. When I refer to screening techniques, what I mean is the debates about exactly that, so the form of screening technique, which is appropriate. Now, this issue, which is being considered by the Maycock group, the form of screening, which is appropriate, is also being raised in correspondence again between Dr. Wallace and the HHD, which provides us some insight into what the HHD, what information it had, and what its thinking was at the time. There's a series of documents, which I'm not going to go into the detail of now, which are summarised in the written note, which begin in February 1973. They're about a trial that Dr. Wallace began of a newer technique, radioimmunoassay, sometimes referred to as RIA, which was more sensitive and more expensive than the method then being used by his RTC, the electrophoretic method. We can see that Dr. Wallace writes to the HHD effectively to say that in order to be able to undertake this trial, he would get some equipment loaned free of charge from Abbott Laboratories. He would need to purchase some reagents. In order to undertake the trial, he asks for the HHD's agreements, the additional funding that would be necessary for that trial to take place. The HHD agrees. Now, I mention that correspondence, which is from February 1973, because it forms the background to some later developments, and in particular to disagreements which emerge later on between the HHD and Dr. Wallace about the appropriateness of different screening methods. Now, we're moving closer to that by going forward to the mid-1970s, the period from 1975. The HHD's involvement in debate over screening techniques intensifies. That debate is taking place in the context of the Maycock group preparing a further report. The documents show that the HHD received a draft version of the Maycock group's updated report in around February 1975. It discussed that draft report internally, discussed it with the SNBTS over subsequent months, and provided comments to the Maycock group. I want to highlight two internal HHD documents from around this time, which touch briefly on the department's understanding of its role in this issue and also its views on screening. The first, please, Lawrence, is SCGV 40/205_085. Now, if we could have, if you could zoom out slightly so we can see the whole document, we can see that this is an internal minute, which is from Dr. Scott. It's dated the 1st of May, 1975. It's addressed to Mr. Roberts and Dr. McIntyre in the HHD. The subject is hepatitis B surface antigen testing. And now if you could please zoom in on the top half of the page, that's great, thank you. Dr. Scott says this. He refers to the NMD, the National Medical Director, which at that time was Major General Jeffreys, has asked if Dr. Wallace and presumably the other RTDs who wish to use RPH reverse passive hemagglutination, one of the screening methods for serum hepatitis, can go ahead now in anticipation of Maycock to introduce the test in place of CI-EOP, which was the technique then generally in use, counter-immunoelectrophoresis.
Osmophoresis.
Osmophoresis, thank you, sir. If we move down to the paragraph that begins, I have no qualms, Dr. Scott says, I have no qualms about anticipating the Maycock report, as I wonder if we could, in any case, stop a regional transfusion director who wished to do RPH now, or indeed RIA. It is, to a great extent, a clinical matter. Similarly, we cannot force Dr. Cash and the others to adopt RPH in place of PH. PH is passive hemagglutination. Dr. Cash in the Edinburgh Regional Transfusion Centre was using a version of passive hemagglutination at the time. He then goes on to say there's a question of money, but that would be up to the NMD. However, this is a matter of such importance, I should have thought that the money must be found. Now, that's one perspective from Dr. Scott at the time on what the department's role was in decisions around the introduction of different screening techniques in RTCs in Scotland. If we go next, please, to PRSE 40704. And this is Dr. McIntyre in the same series of minutes, providing his perspective. So we can see that it's dated 13th of May 1975. It's from Dr. McIntyre to Dr. Scott on the same issue. I'll just read out the first sentence. Dr. McIntyre says, there's no doubt that the advisory group will recommend reverse passive hemagglutination, RPH, for routine screening of blood for hepatitis B surface antigen. It's also likely that following representations from the department, the passive inhibition agglutination test will be accepted as being perfectly satisfactory for the detection of the antigen. What that sentence provides us some insight into is the department's role in commenting on the draft Maycock report before it was circulated more widely. Dr. McIntyre says, from the draft text of the report, it would seem that it would appear that they are approximately equally sensitive. There would seem, therefore, to be no reason why a gradual change should not be made at an early date to one or other of the more sensitive methods. And now into the next paragraph, Dr. McIntyre says that this subject will be sure to come up at the Scottish Transfusion Directors meeting on 11th of June, and if the NMD National Medical Director knew in advance that we were agreeable in principle to the introduction of a more sensitive test, he could perhaps ask the directors to come prepared to discuss at that meeting the test they were likely to adopt and the financial implications thereof. I agree that the question of money will be up to the NMD, but I feel sure that he will eventually come to us for additional money for this purpose. So we can see there officials discussing the different screening tests they consider to be acceptable, also linking decisions around the introduction of those tests to the question of funding, which ultimately comes from the department. Now, the updated Maycock report, which is discussed in these minutes, is eventually finalised in September 1975. That report says that the CI-EOP method is no longer recommended, recommends replacing it with RPH or pH. It also discusses the RIA method, which it says has some extra sensitivity, but that advantage is outweighed by disadvantages, in particular that it's more expensive and more difficult to perform. Now, those recommendations come to be discussed at a December 1975 meeting of SNBTS directors. Important to note when looking at the minutes of that meeting that Dr. Wallace, who's there, emphasises that the recommendations in the Maycock updated report were drafted in early 1975. In other words, suggesting that there was a possibility that they were becoming out of date by the time we get to directors considering and accepting them. Now, by the time we get to March 1976, it seems that the recommendations in the Maycock updated report had been implemented in Scottish RTCs and that the HHD was aware of that. But we get to the summer of 1976, and by this time, differences had begun to emerge between Dr. Wallace and the HHD about the appropriateness of the different techniques which had been covered by the Maycock report. Those differences related in particular to whether funding should be provided for RIA screening, which is a more sensitive method. I'm going to quickly go to a document in which Dr. Wallace set out his position on this issue to the department. It's PRSE 40964. It's a 22nd of June 1976 letter to Dr. McIntyre at the Home and Health Department. We can see at the top of this document that it comes from the Glasgow and West of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service. On the left-hand side at the top, the regional director is Dr. Wallace. And if we go just very briefly to the end of the document, we'll see that it's signed by the regional director, in other words, Dr. Wallace. Now, we could go back, please, Lawrence, to the first page. This letter is headed Total Screening of Donations for Hepatitis B Surface Antigen. I'm not going to read them out, but in the first paragraph, Dr. Wallace describes some of the work undertaken by the Maycock group. In the second paragraph, he says to Dr. McIntyre, "You attended meetings of the Central Advisory Group under the chairmanship of Dr. Maycock on the testing of donations for hepatitis B surface antigen. The views of the members of the advisory group were similar to those reported by the Special WHO group on the same subject. It was acknowledged that radioimmunoassay RIA was the most sensitive method available for the detection of HB surface antigen, but in practical terms, both expert groups recommended that reversed passive hemagglutination, RPHA, should be introduced as a method of total screening because RPHA could be introduced much more rapidly than the more sophisticated RIA technique." So that's Dr. Wallace describing the reasons, as he understood them, for the Maycock group's recommendations. He then goes on at the bottom of this page to describe some of his own involvement. He says, "As a member of the advisory group, I was aware of the views of the members and I decided to continue my original work within the limits of the finance available." So that's work he's undertaking to test different screening methods and to compare their sensitivity. He says, "I discussed the possibility of a further evaluation of RIA with Abbott Laboratories, which is the only firm currently producing reliable reagents for the performance of RIA testing for the antigen. I had sufficient money available to produce reagents for RPHA testing, and Abbott Laboratories agreed to provide me with all the facilities for RIA testing for a period of 1 year at the same cost as would have been incurred by producing reagents for the RPHA." We go over the page to the top couple of paragraphs, thank you, Dr. Wallace describes the trials that he's been undertaking and their results. He says, this proposal was discussed with General Jeffrey, and he agreed that it would be a valuable exercise in respect of A, the feasibility of total screening by RIA and the comparative sensitivity of RIA and of RPHA. The exercise was started in the middle of August 1975 and is due to end in the middle of August 1976. He then summarises some of the key findings of his trial to date. He says, during the first 9 months of the exercise, a total of 99,911 donations were tested and 36 examples of confirmed hepatitis B surface antigen positive donors were found. If we then go down into the paragraph that begins of these 36 examples, thank you. Dr. Wallace says, of these 36 examples of hepatitis B surface antigen, only 13 were detectable by IEOP and only 24 were easily detectable by RPHA. Another 5 specimens gave doubtful positive reactions by RPHA. This means that if we had been relying on RPHA for total screening, we would have missed, in a period of 9 months, at least 7 examples of hepatitis B surface antigen positive donations, and perhaps as many as 12. If we go down, please, Lawrence, to the final paragraph on this page, Dr. Wallace says, there is, in my opinion, substantial evidence in favour of total screening by RIA rather than by RPHA. In the remainder of the letter, he sets out the additional money that would be needed in order for that to be able to take place. And we could just go to the last paragraph of this letter. We have what would appear to be Dr. Wallace referring to the possibility of litigation if his proposal, which is to continue with RIA testing, is not accepted. He says, I've not at this stage informed either the Scottish Legal Office or my own Defence Society of the position because I'm hoping that something can still be done to maintain a sensitive method of testing donations. If by the middle of August we're obliged to find natural reasons to adopt a less sensitive method of testing, then clearly I'll have to inform these bodies. Now, this letter from Dr. Wallace was considered in a number of internal Home and Health Department minutes, which provide some insight into the department's thinking. They're summarised in a written note. We can take that away now. Thank you, Lawrence. And go instead to one of the internal HHD minutes which discusses this letter from Dr. Wallace. And it is SCGV 402005_037. And if we could go to the second page, please, of this document. Thank you. So this is a minute dated the 25th of June 1976 from Dr. McCready in the department to Dr. Scott and Dr. McIntyre. In the first sentence, he refers to Dr. Wallace's letter. He summarises in that first paragraph Dr. Wallace's view. He then says this in the second paragraph. This brings us back to the old question of what can we afford to achieve a marginal improvement in the goal of perfection. According to Dr. Wallace, the cost of RIA screening is 100% more than the cost of RPHA screening test. We have at least the backing of the Maycock committee and WHO for the utilisation of the RPHA test. It's my view that in the present financial climate, it would not be justified to increase our testing costs by 100% to obtain marginally improved sensitivity. Your comments would be welcomed. And if we could go back, please, to the first page, we can see Dr. McIntyre picking up Dr. McCready's comments and providing his own to Dr. Scott. And I'm going to look at the third paragraph that begins Dr. Wallace. Dr. McIntyre says, Dr. Wallace has been involved in the problems of hepatitis right from the beginning and knows that the problem is complex and that hepatitis B is only the tip of the iceberg. If we accede to his request for additional money so that he can continue RIA, then we are saying that this is such a preferable method that we considered the additional expenditure is justified. This leaves us in a difficult situation as regards the other centres. It may be that we could argue that they do not have the equipment necessary and therefore further additional costs over and above the reagent would be involved. Should a case of hepatitis B arise in any of these other regions, however, it could be construed that by implication we were adopting in these regions a less sensitive testing method. And in just the paragraph above that, just draw your attention to, sir, what Dr. McIntyre says in the middle of that paragraph. I do not like what I consider to be the professional blackmail in the last paragraph of Dr. Wallace's letter, which is presumably a reference to Dr. Wallace considering whether or not he needed to be in touch with the Scottish Legal Office about potential changes to screening methods in his region. Now, what's not clear, at least from the face of this document, is exactly what Dr. McIntyre means when he says that Dr. Wallace knows that hepatitis B is only the tip of the iceberg. That may be a reference to non-A, non-B hepatitis. It may be that other readings and inferences are possible. But what we have here is a discussion by these officials of the position the department should adopt in a situation in which a more sensitive method of screening might be available, but it is more expensive than the method which has the previous year been recommended by an expert advisory group. We can take that down now, thanks, Lawrence. Now, I'm not going to go to it, but Dr. McIntyre responds directly to Dr. Wallace on the 30th of June 1976, setting out the department's position. He described the Maycock advisory group as having favoured RPH after weighing up factors such as sensitivity and cost. He noted that the estimated cost of RIA testing on a commercial basis was likely to be twice that of RPH. And he concluded that in light of what was said in the Maycock report, the method of testing recommended by that advisory group should be employed in the west of Scotland as in other transfusion centres in Scotland. Now, that response from the department seems to have led Dr. Wallace to write a letter to chief administrative medical officers and others in his region, including haematologists. That letter comes on the 26th of July 1976. In summary, what Dr. Wallace says in the letter is that RPHA would replace RIA testing in the region as a result of the Home and Health Department's position. And he says that it was estimated that annually this would lead to 9 to 6 chronic carriers of hepatitis B surface antigen not being detected. So linking the change that would need to be introduced in the west of Scotland from RIA to a less sensitive testing method to the department's position. Now, that letter from Dr. Wallace leads to more internal discussion between officials in the Home and Health Department. We can see that, for example, in a 29th of July 1976 minute from Dr. McIntyre to his colleagues. I won't bring it up, but I'll just highlight that Dr. McIntyre says the point at issue is not the sensitivity of the test, this test RIA, of that there's never been any doubt, but the policy to be adopted after consideration of the other factors, such as capital and recurrent costs. In my view, Dr. Wallace has not shown any reason why the present policy should be changed at this time. Now, the correspondence between the officials and Dr. Wallace continued over subsequent months. I'm going to bring up just one further letter from Dr. Wallace, which helps to explain the reasons for his position and shows the information that he provided to the HHD to try to justify it. It is SCGV 40/205_027. Now, this is a 6th of August 1976 letter from Dr. Wallace to Dr. MacDonald, who at that time was DCMO in the department. We can see the subject of the letter from its title. Dr. Wallace goes on in this letter to provide a number of comments to help to explain the position that he'd adopted, both in correspondence with the department and directly to clinicians in his region. He says this: neither the Maycock report nor the WHO report to which you refer is recent. Each report really states views held by experts in the second half of 1974. The two Maycock reports, 1972 and 1975, and the two WHO reports, 1973 and 1975, all make it abundantly clear that the situation is dynamic and that recommendations must, of necessity, be interim. Expert opinion today recommends either RIA or EIA as the technique of choice. In the next paragraph, he picks up that HHD officials were involved in the discussions of the Maycock group, or at least received evidence of those discussions. And he says it's clear from these discussions, notes and papers, that the members of the group, the Maycock group, were in a quandary by the middle of 1974 as to whether to recommend RPHA or RIA. There was a definite polarization of members between finance and sensitivity. If we go over the page to about the middle, the paragraph starting I have told, we have here Dr. Wallace trying to explain the reasons for his letter to CAMOs and other in his region. I've told Dr. McIntyre repeatedly that I accept the sad fact that there is no more money available for developments, but I reserve the right to inform medical colleagues in the region for which I'm responsible that I'm discontinuing the use of RIA, and as a consequence, I anticipate a definite number of false negative donations. What I cannot quantify is the number of cases of type B hepatitis which will result, or the amount of cross-contamination of products and fractions which will occur. And finally, the last paragraph in this letter, and to pick up what Dr. Wallace says here, he refers to recent cases of hepatitis B transmission in the west of Scotland, and then says, I cannot believe that these cases of donations with extremely weak examples of hepatitis B surface antigen transmitting severe viral hepatitis type B are unique to the west of Scotland. What is much more worrying and potentially more serious is the dissemination of these infective agents in multiple blood products. I know that this possibility is causing concern to Maycock and to Watt. That's John Watt, who's at this time scientific director of the Protein Fractionation Centre in Scotland. Thank you, Lawrence. I'm finished with that now. Now, Dr. Wallace continued to make these points, including at meetings with other RTDs in Scotland and to the department. We can see that in a 9th of March 1977 meeting, which is summarised in the written notes. The minutes of that meeting, as well as recording this point from Dr. Wallace, include some more general comments about delays in the advice that's provided by expert groups such as the Maycock Group. And I'm just going to read out one of the entries from those minutes, which records the comments of directors. It says, rapid progress was being made in the use of various blood products with a consequent increase in the risk of the spread of hepatitis. Regional directors were concerned at this increasing risk and would be considering the entire question in the near future. The situation whereby reports of this kind had to be widely circulated for approval prior to publication invariably resulted in the document being somewhat dated, particularly in a developing situation. And there's a suggestion that to...
Do you have a copy of the document to put up and display?
This one, of course, sir, yes. It's SCGV 5079 _ 013. So we can see at the top of this document that it's a meeting of the Scottish Health Service Planning Council Blood Transfusion Advisory Group. In attendance at the meeting is Dr. McIntyre from the HHD, as well as a number of transfusion directors. We can see Dr. Wallace as one of the individuals present at that meeting. We can see the discussion which I was just referring to over the page.
Could you just go back to the top of the page?
Of course.
Thank you. 9th of March
1977.
Thank you.
And why we've got that date, so 9th of March 1977, earlier on I described the Maycock Advisory Group draft report being circulated to the HHD in around February 1975. The report seems to be finalised in September 1975, discussed by directors in Scotland towards the end of that year. Then there seems to be a period over about the following year until around this time in March 1977, before the department circulates it more widely in Scotland with a covering circular. So it's that timing which seems to prompt some of the discussions that we see in these minutes. If you go over the page, please, Lawrence. Thank you. It's the top half of this page, the entry paragraph that begins report of the advisory group on the testing for hepatitis B surface antigen and its antibody. We can see in the second sentence Dr. Wallace emphasising the point he'd made at a previous meeting that the information in the report was based on 1974 data and was now substantially out of date. He says, in view of the considerable advances which have been made in the meantime, he and most members of the Maycock group would no longer agree with the main recommendations of the report. Refers to a further report that's been prepared by the WHO. And then the entry which I had started to read out earlier, rapid progress was being made in the use of various blood products with a consequent increase in the risk of the spread of hepatitis.
Yes, he introduces it by saying, in view of the considerable advances which have been made in the meantime, i.e. since the drafting of the report, he and most of the members of the Maycock group would no longer agree with the main recommendations of the report.
That's exactly right, sir. Yes, that's Dr. Wallace's contribution at this time, March 1977.
And then he goes on to the bit you're now quoting.
Yes,
let's have a look at that.
Yeah, that's right, sir, yes. Regional directors were concerned at this increasing risk and would be considering the entire question in the near future. The situation whereby reports of this kind had to be widely circulated for approval prior to publication invariably resulted in the documents being somewhat dated, particularly in a developing situation. There's then a suggestion for how to deal with this issue. However, a suggestion that this situation could be overcome by the issue of updating information sheets was thought to have considerable merit. It would also avoid having to go over old ground again. It was intimated that the report was initially a report to the health departments for consideration of any financial implications, although tests recommended in the report had been in use for some considerable time. And there's a reference at the end there to apprehension amongst staff working in these centres. And while we've still got this paragraph up, so the first sentence at the beginning, the second report of the advisory group had now been circulated under cover of NHS Circular 1977 GEN2. It was that recent development that I was describing earlier, which is wide circulation of this Maycock September 1975 report not taking place until 1977, though regional directors were aware of its recommendations earlier.
So the concern which he's expressing in the bit which begins rapid progress is the use of blood products, which would include presumably clotting factors, lead to a consequent increase in the risk of the spread of hepatitis, and it's that risk which they think is now more concerning, and therefore there's a greater case for effective screening. That's what he's saying, is it?
That's exactly right, sir, yes. And that would be consistent with a document we looked at earlier from Dr. Wallace to the department, and Dr. Wallace linked some of his concerns about the sensitivity of the test to developments in the use of blood products, to Mr. Watt at the PFC, and the use of fractions.
Yes, thank you.
We're finished with that now, thanks, Lawrence. Now, in the remainder of the 1970s, the early 1980s, we can see in the documents further consideration of screening methods. That includes developments, for example, a lower cost RIA and other methods. Trials of different techniques were being undertaken at RTCs. I'm not going to go into the detail of those developments now. The Maycock Advisory Group is reconvened under a different chair. The written note summarises the HHD's involvement in those developments. I'm going to move forward finally on this topic, sir, to a last couple of documents in 1981, which is relevant to how the HHD understood its role in relation to screening and also what transfusion directors' responsibilities were. So in May 1981, a further report from the advisory group on hepatitis B testing, by this point under a different chair, had become available. That report was discussed at a meeting which was attended by the HHD. It considered the merits of different screening methods which had developed by this point beyond those that we've been looking at, RIA, ELISA tests, and RPHA tests. That updated report recommended minimum sensitivity levels for tests used by RTCs. We can also see from that report a conclusion that it was only possible to lay down approximate guidelines for the sensitivity of testing. And if we could go to PRSE 303920, we can see a meeting of SNBTS directors, 22nd of September 1981, chaired by Professor Cash, attended by Dr. Bell and also Mr. Finney for the department, in which there's discussion of this report. Could we go to page 5, please? Thank you. Down a little bit further, so we can see the whole of section 5, thank you. Testing for hepatitis. Professor Cash introduces the report that I was just seeking to summarise. There's a discussion of that report's recommendations, and I just wanted to pick up Dr. Bell's comments here. Dr. Bell is recorded as having advised that that document was not intended to provide a legal safety net, but to provide guidelines on the best procedures to be adopted, and that directors' clinical judgment and adherence to the recommendations within the finance available was all that could be expected of them. So we see here Dr. Bell emphasising that the use of particular screening tests that were available by this point was a matter of clinical judgment, also recognising that those choices had to be made within the finance that was available, the finance that was available ultimately being a matter for the department. So that was all I intended to say about hepatitis B screening and hepatitis B for today. I'm going to move on now to another topic. I note the time, 11:10. I wonder if this would be a convenient moment for a break. Alternatively, I can start on our next topic, which is going to be HIV and AIDS.
Yes, well, let's do that then and come back to HIV and AIDS at 22:12. 20 to 12.